Picture this. You're an elite janissary, a veteran of the fall of Constantinople, standing on the edge of a thick, suffocating fog in the Moldavian marshlands. The year is 1475. You've heard the stories of Vlad the Impaler, the man the world calls Dracula, and his forest of corpses. But what stands before you now is something far more chilling, because it isn't the work of a madman. It is the work of a mathematician of death. As the mist clears, you don't just see bodies. You see a landscape transformed into a psychological trap. Thousands of Ottoman scouts have been executed, but not in a chaotic display of rage. They're arranged in perfect, terrifying formations, their eyes fixed on the path you must take, and on every tree a small silver bell has been tied to their frozen fingers. When the wind blows, the forest doesn't scream. It chimes, a delicate heavenly sound that signals your approaching doom. This was the calling card of Stephen the Great. While the world trembled at the name of Dracula, the Sultan himself, Mehmed the Conqueror, realised that the true threat wasn't the monster who drank blood, but the king who could break a soldier's soul before the battle even began. Why did the most powerful empire on earth fear this man more than the legendary vampire? What did this athlete of Christ know about terror that the Impaler did not? To understand the fear, we have to look past the myth and into the cold, calculated eyes of the man who turned a tiny principality into the graveyard of empires. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why the Ottoman Empire looked at Moldavia with such dread, we first have to talk about the man who paved the way, Vlad the Impaler. The history books often link these two men together, and for good reason. They were cousins, allies, and at times bitter rivals. But where Vlad was a flickering flame, bright, violent, and quickly extinguished, Stephen the Great was a slow-burning furnace. By the mid-15th century, Moldavian history was a chaotic mess of shifting loyalties and bloody successions. The Ottoman Expansion was no longer a distant threat, it was a tidal wave swallowing the Balkans whole. Mehmed the Conqueror had already taken the Queen of Cities, Constantinople, and he was looking north. He expected Moldavia to be a simple stepping stone, a minor speed bump on his way to Central Europe. He thought he knew what to expect from these barbarians. He had dealt with Vlad's psychological games before, and while they were disturbing, they were ultimately manageable for an empire of millions. But Stephen was different. When Stephen took the throne in 1457, he didn't just want to resist the Turks, he wanted to dismantle their sense of invincibility. He spent the first decade of his reign doing something Vlad never could, building a professional, loyal, and terrifyingly efficient state. He didn't just impale people for the sake of a spectacle. Every execution, every burnt village, and every poisoned well was part of a grander strategic design. In the comparison of Vlad the Impaler versus Stephen the Great, the difference lies in the objective. Vlad wanted to be feared by his enemies. Stephen wanted to be impossible to defeat by them. The Ottomans were masters of medieval warfare. They had the cannons, they had the numbers, and they had the janissaries. Yet, as they marched into the damp forested hills of Stephen's domain, they realised their traditional advantages meant nothing. They weren't fighting an army, they were fighting the land itself, manipulated by a man who treated war like a divine liturgy. Stephen wasn't just a general, he was becoming a legend that would eventually earn him the title Athlete of Christ from the Pope. But in 1475, he was simply the man who was about to give the Ottoman Empire its most humiliating defeat in history. As we look at the maps of the era, Moldavia looks like a tiny speck against the massive shadow of the crescent moon. But that speck was about to become a wall of iron that even the conqueror of Constantinople couldn't break. The terror Stephen instilled wasn't based on supernatural myths. It was based on the reality of a leader who could disappear into the woods and reappear behind your supply lines with 10,000 horsemen who fought as if they were already dead. He understood the Ottoman psyche better than anyone. He knew that if you kill a man, you remove one enemy. But if you break a man's mind, you defeat an entire battalion. This is the story of how a ruler of a small mountain-shielded nation became the one man the Sultan couldn't sleep at night thinking about. It wasn't about the blood, it was about the brilliance. And it all started with a young prince who clawed his way to power through a sea of betrayal. History often remembers the crown, but it rarely remembers the blood it took to put it on. To understand why Stephen the Great became the most formidable strategist of his age, we have to travel back to a cold October night in 1451 at a place called Rusini. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a wedding. In the tradition of the time, feasts were supposed to be sacred, a time of truce. But in the brutal landscape of 15th century Moldavian history, a truce was often just a convenient time to sharpen a knife. Stephen was just a teenager then, watching as his father, Prince Bogdan the Hen, was decapitated in front of his eyes by his own brother, Stephen's uncle, Petru Aron. Imagine that for a second. The person you trust most, your own flesh and blood, committing an act of such cold-blooded betrayal that it shatters your world in a single stroke. This was the baptism of fire for the young prince. He didn't just lose a father, he lost a country, a home, and any sense of safety. He was forced into a desperate exile, fleeing into the mountains with nothing but his name and a burning desire for justice. It was during these years of wandering that Stephen's path crossed with another exiled prince, who was also haunted by the shadow of the Ottoman Expansion, Vlad III, better known to us as Dracula. For a time, these two were more than just cousins. They were brothers in arms, two dispossessed royals sharing bread and planning their return in the camps of Transylvania. This period of Vlad the Impaler versus Stephen the Great is perhaps the most fascinating what-if in history. They learned the art of survival together. They studied the Ottoman way of war, not from books but from the scars they carried and the stories of the refugees they met. Vlad taught Stephen the power of terror, the idea that a ruler must be feared to be obeyed. But Stephen, ever the observer, noticed something Vlad didn't. Terror without a foundation of loyalty is a house built on sand. While Vlad was becoming the monster of Wallachia, Stephen was becoming something else, a statesman. In 1457, after 6 long years in the wilderness, it was time. With a small force of about 6,000 horsemen, many of them provided by Vlad, Stephen crossed the border back into Moldavia. He wasn't just coming for his uncle, he was coming for the soul of his nation. The Battle of Dolgest wasn't just a military victory, it was a statement. When he defeated Petru Aron and sent him fleeing, Stephen didn't just march into the capital of Suceava. He did something that showed his genius for public relations and legitimacy. He went to a place called Direptate, a vast open field, and stood before the common people, the boyars, and the clergy. He didn't seize the crown, he asked them if they wanted him to lead. In an era of absolute autocrats, this was a revolutionary move. By being elected by the assembly, he became the people's prince, not just another warlord. But the Moldavia he inherited was a mess. It was a tiny state surrounded by hungry wolves. To the north, the Polish kingdom wanted a puppet. To the west, the Hungarian kingdom under Matthias Corvinus wanted a vassal. And to the south, the shadow of the crescent moon was growing longer every day. Mehmed the Conqueror had just turned the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and his eyes were now fixed on the trade routes of the Black Sea. Moldavia sat right in the middle of those routes. Stephen knew that if he played the traditional game of medieval warfare, simply building walls and waiting, he would be crushed. He had to be smarter. He had to be faster. He spent his first years on the throne purging the treacherous nobility who had supported his father's killer, but he did it with a surgical precision that would make a modern CEO blush. He replaced the corrupt boyars with men of low birth but high loyalty, men who owed everything to him. He built a small army of professional guards and a large army of free peasants who were given land in exchange for military service. This was the secret to his longevity. While other kings relied on fickle mercenaries who would desert at the first sign of trouble, Stephen's soldiers were fighting for their own soil, their own families, and a king who had stood in the mud with them. By the time the first Ottoman envoys arrived at his court demanding tribute, they didn't find a terrified boy. They found a man who had been forged in the fires of exile and betrayal. Stephen knew that the peace they offered was a lie, a golden cage that would eventually lead to the destruction of his faith and his people. He chose a different path, a path of total defiance. He knew he couldn't win a fair fight against the Sultans' hundreds of thousands, so he decided he would never give them a fair fight. He began to turn Moldavia into a fortress without walls, a place where every forest was an ambush and every river was a grave. The Moldavian Game of Thrones was over. The era of the great had begun. To most kings of the 15th century, a forest was a source of timber or a place to hunt deer. To Stephen the Great, the forest was a fortress that could breathe, move and kill. As the shadow of the Ottoman expansion loomed larger, Stephen knew that his greatest ally wouldn't be the walls of Suceava, but the very soil of his homeland. He began to implement a strategy that was as brilliant as it was heart-wrenching: the doctrine of the scorched earth. Imagine being a Moldavian peasant, having spent months tending to your wheat and livestock, only for your king's riders to arrive with a terrifying command: burn it all, burn the crops, slaughter the cattle you can't carry, and throw the carcasses into the wells. It sounds like the act of a tyrant, but it was the cold, calculated math of survival. Stephen understood that an Ottoman army of 100,000 men didn't just fight with swords, they fought with their stomachs. By the time the Sultan's forces crossed the border, they weren't entering a land of plenty. They were entering a silent, blackened void. This was medieval warfare, stripped of its chivalry and reduced to its most brutal essence. Stephen's small army of professional cavalry didn't meet the Ottomans in open fields. Instead, they became shadows. They practiced a form of asymmetric warfare that would feel eerily familiar to modern special forces. They moved through the dense Moldavian woods with a speed the heavy Ottoman baggage trains couldn't hope to match. They would strike at midnight, screaming out of the darkness to set fire to supply wagons, and by the time the Janissaries had formed their defensive squares, the Moldavians were gone, melted back into the fog and the trees. It was an exhausting, relentless pressure. Every mile the Ottomans gained cost them hundreds of men to hunger, disease, and the constant fear of a knife in the dark. Stephen also perfected the art of the psychological trap. He knew that the Ottoman soldiers were deeply superstitious and far from home. He used the terrain to amplify their dread. He would order his men to blow massive ox horns from different mountain peaks simultaneously, creating an acoustic illusion that made a few hundred men sound like tens of thousands. He would leave small, puzzling tokens in the paths of the Ottoman scouts, strange carvings on trees, or the silver bells we mentioned before, to make them feel as though they were being watched by something more than just human soldiers. While Vlad the Impaler used the shock of a single, massive display of carnage to terrify his enemies, Stephen used a death by 1,000 cuts. He wanted the Ottomans to feel that Moldavia itself was rejecting them, that the very air was poisonous and the water was cursed. Behind this chaos was a meticulous logistical network. While the Ottomans starved, Stephen's men were well fed, thanks to a system of hidden underground grain pits known only to the locals. He had turned the entire nation into a giant living organism geared for war. Every shepherd was a scout. Every monk in a mountain monastery was a lookout. This was the true strength of Moldavian history during this period, the total mobilization of a society. Stephen wasn't just a general leading an army, he was a conductor leading a symphony of resistance. He was teaching the world that power isn't just about the size of your empire, but about the depth of your resolve and the intelligence of your design. As the year 1474 drew to a close, the Sultan's patience finally snapped. Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had humbled emperors, decided he would no longer deal with this troublesome prince through subordinates. He ordered a massive invasion force, led by his most trusted general, Haddam Suleiman Pasha. Over 120,000 men began their march toward the heart of Moldavia. They expected a quick victory, a final crushing of the Moldavian spirit. What they didn't know was that Stephen had already chosen the place where they would die. He had found a small valley near the town of Vaslui, a place of mud and mist, and he was currently transforming it into the ultimate killing floor. The stage was set for the greatest clash of the century, and the Ottomans were walking straight into a nightmare they couldn't even imagine. By 1474, the Ottoman Empire was not just a kingdom. It was an unstoppable force of nature. Mehmed the Conqueror had spent decades reshaping the world. He had dismantled the Byzantine Empire, broken the resistance of the Serbians, and forced the powerful Venetians to pay him tribute. To Mehmed, the map of Europe was a puzzle he was nearly finished solving. But there was one piece that refused to fit: a small, stubborn territory nestled between the Carpathian Mountains and the Black Sea. Moldavia. For years, Stephen the Great had played a dangerous game, refusing to pay the jizya, the heavy tax demanded from non-Muslim subjects, and instead using that gold to buy cannons and pay his heavy cavalry. Mehmed, a man who believed he was the shadow of God on earth, could no longer tolerate this insolence. He didn't just want Moldavia's gold, he wanted Stephen's head on a silver platter to show the world what happened to those who defied the sublime porte. The call to war went out across the Ottoman Expansion. From the plains of Anatolia to the rugged mountains of the Balkans, the Sultan's machine began to grind. This wasn't a mere border skirmish, this was a total mobilization. Mehmed appointed Hadam Suleiman Pasha, the governor of Rumelia and one of his most experienced commanders, to lead a host that some chroniclers of the time estimated at over 120,000 men. Among them were the Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers who were the terror of the medieval world, alongside thousands of Spy heavy cavalry and Akunci light horsemen. They carried with them the most advanced artillery of the age, massive bronze cannons that had once shattered the triple walls of Constantinople. As this sea of steel and silk began its slow march north, the dust from their horses was said to blot out the sun for miles. In the eyes of any rational observer, Moldavia was already lost. But while the Ottomans marched with the arrogance of conquerors, Stephen was busy preparing a tomb. He knew he couldn't stop this tidal wave at the border, so he lured them deeper into his trap. He chose a specific valley near Vaslui, at a place called Podul-Inalt, the High Bridge. Geographically, it was a nightmare for a large army. The valley was narrow, flanked by steep, wooded hills, and the ground was a treacherous marshland. Stephen knew that in medieval warfare numbers only matter if you have the space to use them. If he could funnel the Ottoman masses into this bottleneck, their superior numbers would become their greatest weakness. He spent weeks reinforcing the area, not with stone walls but with invisible obstacles. He had his men dig hidden pits and sharpen thousands of stakes, concealing them beneath the tall grass and the freezing mud. As the Ottoman vanguard approached Vaslui in January 1475, the weather itself seemed to join Stephen's cause. A thick grey fog descended over the valley, reducing visibility to just a few yards. The ground was half frozen, creating a slick, murderous surface for the Ottoman camels and heavy horses. Suleiman Pasha, confident in his sheer weight of numbers, pushed his men forward into the mist. He couldn't see the hills around him, and he couldn't hear the silence of the woods. He didn't know that Stephen's small army was perched just above him, breathing softly, waiting for the signal. Stephen had positioned his few cannons on the high ground, aimed not at the soldiers, but at the narrow bridge that was the only way in or out of the valley. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. On one side, the most powerful empire in the world, brimming with the confidence of 100 victories. On the other, a prince with a ragtag army of peasants and knights standing in the cold mud of their home. Stephen was not just fighting for a throne, he was fighting for the survival of a culture and a faith. He had told his men that day that God was their only witness, and the mud was their only shield. As the main body of the Ottoman army crowded into the swampy floor of the valley, their ranks becoming a tangled mess of men and animals, Stephen raised his sword. The trap was set. The shadow of the crescent moon had finally fallen over Vaslui, but it was about to be eclipsed by a storm of Moldavian steel. The Battle of Vaslui was no longer a possibility. It was a looming catastrophe for the Sultan. The morning of January 10th, 1475, did not begin with a roar of cannons or the clash of steel. It began with a silence so heavy it felt physical. A thick grey shroud of fog had swallowed the valley of Podul-Inalt, turning the world into a landscape of ghosts. For the Ottoman commander, Süleyman Pasha, this was a nuisance, but not a threat. He had over 120,000 men under his command, a sea of soldiers so vast that they had to march in staggered columns just to fit on the road. He could hear the squelch of thousands of boots in the freezing mud and the rhythmic clanking of janissary armour. He assumed the Moldavians had fled into the mountains, terrified by the sheer scale of the Ottoman expansion. He was wrong. Just a few hundred yards away, hidden by the mist and the tree line, Stephen the Great was watching. He wasn't looking at the army as a whole, he was looking at the bridge. In the logic of medieval warfare, numbers are usually the ultimate decider. But Stephen had spent weeks studying the physics of this specific valley. He knew that the bridge over the Barlad River was a choke point. As the Ottoman vanguard crossed, the army began to bunch up, like water hitting a narrow pipe. The fog, which Suleiman thought was his cover, was actually Stephen's greatest weapon. Suddenly the silence was shattered, not by a charge, but by the sound of a single, lonely trumpet blowing from the hills to the left, then another from the right, then from the rear. To the Ottomans, it sounded like they were being surrounded by a force 5 times their size. Panic, that invisible virus of the battlefield, began to spread through the ranks. Then came the fire. Stephen had positioned his 20 cannons, small by Ottoman standards, but perfectly placed, on the high ground. They opened fire not at the front of the column, but at the bridge itself. The structure groaned and collapsed, trapping thousands of Ottoman soldiers in the marshy basin below. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. From the wooded slopes, thousands of Moldavian archers let fly. They weren't aiming for individuals, they were raining death into a concentrated mass of humanity that had nowhere to run. The heavy Ottoman cavalry, the spies, found their horses sinking chest-deep into the freezing mud. Their armour, designed for the open plains of Anatolia, became a leaden weight that dragged them down into the mire. But Stephen the Great knew that a trapped animal is still dangerous. He didn't just wait for them to die. He led the final charge himself. Imagine the sight. The king of Moldavia, armoured in polished steel, descending from the mist at the head of his heavy cavalry. They didn't hit the Ottomans like a wave, they hit them like a hammer. The Janissaries, the elite who had never known defeat, tried to form their famous defensive squares, but the ground beneath them was liquid. They were being hacked down by peasants wielding scythes and axes, men who were fighting for the very dirt they stood on. The Battle of Vaslui quickly turned from a conflict into a massacre. The carnage was so absolute that later Ottoman chroniclers would describe the valley as a sea of blood and turbans. Süleyman Pasha, realising the day was lost, attempted to rally a retreat, but the Moldavians had already circled behind his lines. For 3 days, Stephen's light cavalry hunted the remnants of the Ottoman host through the snow and the forests. It is said that out of the 120,000 men who entered the valley, barely a third escaped back across the Danube. This was not just a defeat for Mehmed the Conqueror, it was a humiliation. The news sent shockwaves through the courts of Europe. After decades of Ottoman victories, someone had finally broken the spell of their invincibility. When the dust, or rather the mist, finally settled, the sheer scale of what Stephen had achieved became clear. He had defeated the largest invading force the Ottomans had ever sent against a Christian nation up to that point. While the world was still obsessed with the tales of Vlad the Impaler versus Stephen the Great, the reality on the ground was that Stephen had done what Vlad never could. He had held the line in a pitched battle and destroyed a sultan's pride. But Stephen didn't celebrate with banquets or trophies. He did something that solidified his legend in Moldavian history. He ordered a 40-day fast for his entire army, attributing the victory not to his own brilliance but to divine providence. He was crafting an image that would eventually lead the Pope to call him the athlete of Christ. Yet, as he stood among the thousands of captured Ottoman banners, Stephen knew this wasn't the end. He knew Mehmed the Conqueror would never forget this insult. The Sultan was a man who took cities as a hobby. He would not let a mountain prince get away with destroying his finest army. The shadow of the crescent moon had been pushed back, but it was gathering strength for a return. Stephen had won the battle, but the war for the soul of the Balkans was only just beginning. he began to prepare for the Sultan's personal vengeance, knowing that the next time, the conqueror himself would be leading the charge. When news of the disaster at Vaslui reached the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, the air itself seemed to freeze. Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees, did not take defeat well. Chroniclers say his rage was so cold, it terrified even his closest viziers. To Mehmed, Stephen the Great was no longer just a rebellious vassal. He was a personal insult to the Ottoman expansion. The Sultan realised that if this mountain prince were allowed to keep his victory, the spark of resistance would spread across the Balkans like wildfire. In the spring of 1476, Mehmed did something he rarely did for such a small territory. He raised the great standard of the Prophet and announced that he would lead the invasion himself. This was no longer a border dispute, this was a war of extinction. The Ottoman machine roared back to life with a vengeance. Mehmed assembled a force that dwarfed the one lost at Vaslui, nearly 150,000 soldiers, including the full might of the Janissary Corps and a massive siege train. But he didn't just attack from the south. In a brilliant and ruthless strategic move, he coordinated with the Crimean Tatars to strike Moldavia from the east simultaneously. Stephen was now caught in a giant pincer movement. This is where we see the true meaning of total war in medieval warfare. Stephen knew he couldn't win a pitched battle against the Sultan's main host, while his eastern flank was being ravaged by Tatar raiders. He made a heartbreaking decision. He sent his main army to deal with the Tatars, while he, with only a small guard of a few thousand men, stayed behind to face the Sultan of the world. As Mehmed's army crossed the Danube, they found a land that had been transformed into a wasteland. Stephen had doubled down on his scorched-earth policy. Every village was a pile of ash. Every field was a blackened square. The Moldavian history of this year is written in smoke. For the Ottoman soldiers, the psychological toll was immense. They marched for weeks without seeing a single living soul, yet they felt eyes on them from every shadow. The heat of the summer intensified the stench of poisoned wells and dead livestock. Mehmed, however, was not like his generals. He was a master of logistics. He brought his fleet up the rivers to supply his men, bypassing the dead land. He was determined to hunt Stephen down no matter the cost. The two forces finally collided in July 1476 at a place called Valea Alba, the White Valley. The name was tragically prophetic. It would soon be white with the bleached bones of the fallen. Stephen had entrenched his small force on a wooded plateau, protected by deep trenches and log barricades. When the Ottoman vanguard attacked, they were met with a wall of fire from Stephen's hand cannons. For hours, the small Moldavian force held back the tide. Even the Janissaries hesitated as they watched their brothers fall in heaps before the wooden walls. But the sheer weight of numbers was undeniable. Mehmed, sensing the moment, ordered his personal guard to charge. The Moldavian line finally broke. Stephen himself was nearly captured. He fought with a desperation that bordered on the suicidal, his armour dented and soaked in blood. Only the fanatical loyalty of his remaining knights allowed him to escape into the thick forests he knew so well. To any other king, the Battle of Valea Alba would have been the end. His army was shattered, his capital was under threat, and the Sultan was standing on his soil. But this is where the legend of Stephen the Great shifts from a military commander to a symbol of national endurance. Mehmed the Conqueror moved to besiege the great fortresses of Suceava and Neamț, expecting them to crumble. But he had underestimated the spirit Stephen had instilled in his people. Even with their king in hiding, the fortresses refused to surrender. Behind the stone walls, women and old men fought alongside the remaining soldiers, pouring boiling oil and raining arrows onto the Sultan's elite. Meanwhile, from the shadows of the Carpathian Mountains, Stephen was already rebuilding. He used a network of secret mountain paths to gather the survivors of the Tatar campaign. As the weeks turned into months, the Sultan's victory began to taste like ashes. Plague broke out in the Ottoman camp, fueled by the poor water and the sweltering heat. The scorched earth policy was finally winning the war of attrition. Mehmed, the man who had conquered Constantinople, found himself in a stalemate against a ghost. He could hold the valleys, but he couldn't hold the spirit of the land. In August 1476, frustrated and with his army wasting away from hunger and disease, the conqueror of the world did the unthinkable. He ordered a retreat. He left Moldavia without a treaty, without a captive king, and with his pride badly wounded. Stephen had lost the Battle of Valea Alba, but he had won the war of survival. The world watched in awe as the Sultan's massive host trudged back south, defeated not by a sword, but by the sheer, unyielding will of a man who refused to give up his home. Imagine you are standing in a cold, dark cellar room at the Suceava fortress in the winter of 1477. The flickering candlelight casts a man's shadow onto the grey stone walls. That is Stephen the Great. He is no longer the ambitious young man of 20 years ago. His face is now a map of scars and anxiety. Mehmed II has retreated, but the price of that victory was exhaustion. The land of Moldavia is now a vast graveyard under the white snow. The burned fields still smell of ash, and his most elite soldiers lie under the mud of the Valea Alba Valley. Amidst that deadly silence, an envoy from Rome appears, carrying a letter from Pope Sixtus IV. The letter contains no promise of reinforcements, nor gold for cannons. It only contains a title, Athleta Christi, Athlete of Christ. In the context of the Ottoman expansion in the 15th century, this title was a supreme honour, placing Stephen alongside legendary heroes like Skanderbeg of Albania. But for a realist like Stephen, it was a bitter irony. Europe was calling him the shield of Christendom. But they let that shield endure the steel storms from the east alone. This is a dark and contemplative chapter in Moldavian history. Stephen understood that the Western powers like the Kingdom of Poland or Hungary were playing a double-sided political game. They were happy to see Stephen weaken the Ottoman army, but they feared him becoming too powerful. They sent him flowery letters but closed their arsenals. Medieval warfare is not just a story of swords and shields, but also a story of logistics and finance. Stephen realised he was trapped in a geopolitical loneliness. He wrote letters to the Christian kingdoms in a voice both urgent and authoritative. If this gate, which is our country, is lost, then the entire Christian world will fall into great danger. He was not exaggerating. Moldavia was indeed the gateway to Central Europe. If it collapsed, the road to Vienna or Krakow would be wide open before the Janissary horses. However, instead of help, Stephen only received cheap praise. It was at this moment that the difference between Stephen the Great and Dracula became clearest. While Dracula often chose to react with sudden brutality when betrayed, Stephen chose diplomatic patience and silent resilience. He began an unprecedented reconstruction campaign. Unable to rely on foreign nations, Stephen relied on the faith and devotion of his own people. After every victory, he commissioned the building of a church or monastery. This was not just a pious act. It was a genius psychological warfare strategy. These structures were symbols of the permanence of Moldavian culture under the pressure of the Islamic Empire. They were spiritual milestones reminding the peasants that they were not just fighting for a piece of land, but for a higher ideal. Monasteries like Putna or Voronezh became spiritual fortresses, holding knowledge, history and national pride. But the pressure from the south never diminished. Mehmed the Conqueror may have retreated, but the machine of the Ottoman Empire never stopped. The Sultan's governors at the borders constantly carried out harassments, kidnapping the population and disrupting trade. Stephen had to maintain a state of high vigilance for decades. He became a master in the use of spies and intelligence networks. He knew about the Sultan's maneuvers even before they crossed the Danube. He learned how to divide the Ottoman allies, bringing Tatar tribes or the Sultan's rivals in Asia Minor to his side. The life of Stephen the Great during this period is a lesson in resilience. He teaches us that greatness comes not only from glorious victories, but also from the ability to stand firm when everyone else has given up. The title Athlete of Christ was ultimately proven not by the Pope's words, but by the fact that he held out for more than 40 years against an empire with resources hundreds of times greater than his country. Stephen was not just a warrior. He was an architect of survival, who turned a small nation into an entity that even the greatest conquerors had to respect. But the darkness was slowly closing in, and the final trials of his life would be the harshest, as old age and new betrayals began to emerge. By the year 1497, Stephen the Great was a man who had outlived his rivals, his allies, and almost his own body. He was in his 60s, an age of incredible seniority for the 15th century. A chronic leg wound sustained decades earlier during a siege had turned into a constant throbbing reminder of his mortality. He walked with a limp, and his hair was as white as the snow on the Carpathian peaks. But if his body was failing, his mind remained as sharp as a Moldavian broadsword. To the world, he was still the athlete of Christ, a living legend who had survived the Ottoman Expansion and outlasted Mehmed the Conqueror. However, a new threat was rising from the north. King John I Albert of Poland, a young and ambitious monarch, decided that the Moldavian problem needed a final solution. Under the guise of a crusade to retake the fortresses of Chilia and Akerman from the Turks, John Albert marched an army of 80,000 men into Moldavia. But Stephen's spies had already intercepted the truth. The Polish king didn't want to fight the Sultan. He wanted to depose Stephen and place his own brother on the throne. This was the ultimate betrayal. For decades, Stephen had been the shield of the West, only to find the West's largest kingdom trying to stab him in the back. As the massive Polish host, filled with heavy knights, and the flower of Polish nobility crossed the border, Stephen didn't panic. He played the game he knew best. He retreated. He led the Polish army deep into the heart of his territory, once again employing the scorched-earth tactics that had broken the Ottomans. By the time John Albert reached the capital of Suceava, his men were hungry, exhausted, and disillusioned. After a failed siege, the Polish king realized he had underestimated the old lion. He agreed to a truce and promised to retreat via the same road he came. But Stephen knew the Polish character too well. He knew that as soon as they were out of his sight, they would try to pillage the fertile lands they hadn't touched yet. The Polish army broke the truce and diverted their path toward the Kosmin forest. This was exactly what Stephen had anticipated. In the history of medieval warfare, the Battle of Kosmin Forest remains a masterclass in using the environment as a force multiplier. Stephen had only a fraction of the Polish numbers, mostly light cavalry and peasant infantry, but he had the trees. He had sent thousands of woodsmen ahead of the Polish retreat. They didn't just hide, they prepared the forest. They partially sawed through the trunks of massive oak trees along the narrow road, securing them with ropes. As the Polish heavy cavalry, crowded with their wagons and banners, entered the thickest part of the woods, Stephen gave the signal. The forest literally fell on the Polish army. With a thunderous roar, the massive oaks came crashing down, crushing knights in their shining armour and creating an impenetrable labyrinth of branches and debris. The Polish army was sliced into isolated segments. In the chaos that followed, Stephen's men emerged from the shadows. This wasn't a battle of manoeuvres, it was a slaughter in the woods. The Moldavian peasants, fueled by the rage of being betrayed by their fellow Christians, used hooks to pull knights off their horses and finish them with axes. The pride of Poland was decimated in the mud and the undergrowth. King John Albert barely escaped with his life, leaving behind his treasury, his banners, and the myth of Polish superiority. This victory cemented Stephen's status as more than just a survivor. He was a strategic genius who understood that a nation's strength lies in its intimacy with its own land. While the world continued to debate the legacy of Vlad the Impaler versus Stephen the Great, the Battle of Kosmin Forest provided a clear answer. Vlad was a master of the psychological shock, but Stephen was a master of the systematic destruction of an enemy's will. He proved that Moldavian history was not just a footnote to the stories of empires, but a saga of a people who refused to be pawns in someone else's game. Even the Ottoman expansion was momentarily halted as the Sultan watched the news of the Polish defeat, with a mixture of relief and renewed fear. After the battle, Stephen did something that reflected his complex character. He didn't just celebrate the death of his enemies, he used the captured Polish noblemen to plough the fields of the very villages they had tried to destroy. It was a poetic, brutal form of justice. He was sending a message to the courts of Europe. Moldavia is not a prize to be won, it is a thorn that will bleed anyone who tries to grasp it. As he sat back in Suceava, his leg aching more than ever, Stephen knew his time was running out. He had defended his borders against the Sultan, the King of Hungary, and now the King of Poland. He was the last of the great medieval crusaders, standing alone in a world that was rapidly changing. The next challenge wouldn't be a king or a sultan, but the inevitable transition of power to a son who had never known a world without his father's shadow. By the summer of 1504, the air in the princely court of Suceava was thick with a sense of an ending. Outside the stone walls, the Moldavian summer was in full bloom, but inside, the man who had defined an entire era was fading. Stephen the Great had reigned for 47 years. In the brutal world of 15th century Moldavian history, where kings were often measured in months rather than decades, 47 years was not just a reign, it was a miracle. He had outlived 3 sultans, including the mighty Mehmed the Conqueror. He had survived assassination attempts, betrayals and wounds that would have claimed a lesser man in days, but as he lay on his deathbed, his leg wound, finally refusing to heal despite the efforts of the finest doctors from Venice, Stephen wasn't thinking about the battles he had won. He was thinking about what he would leave behind. He knew that the Ottoman expansion would not stop just because he was gone. He knew the shadow of the crescent moon would return, and he needed to ensure his people had something stronger than stone walls to protect them. This is where the athlete of Christ truly earned his name. Throughout his reign, Stephen had practiced a unique form of spiritual architecture. Legend says that after every major military victory, he commissioned the construction of a church or a monastery. Whether exactly true or not, the landscape of Moldavia was transformed under his hand. He didn't just build these structures for his own glory, he built them to anchor the Moldavian soul. These weren't the cold, imposing cathedrals of Western Europe. They were intimate, vibrantly painted sanctuaries that blended local tradition with Byzantine elegance. The Putna Monastery, his final resting place, became the spiritual heart of the nation. These buildings served as a spiritual defensive line. Even if the Ottoman armies burned the villages and occupied the valleys, they could not easily erase the identity etched into the frescoes of these churches. Stephen understood a fundamental truth of medieval warfare that many modern leaders forget. You can occupy a territory with soldiers, but you can only hold a nation if you control its story. But Stephen was also a pragmatist. On his deathbed, he called for his son and successor, Bogdan III. The conversation that took place is one of the most poignant moments in Eastern European history. Stephen, the man who had spent his life in total defiance of the Sublime Porte, gave his son a surprising piece of advice. He realised that the geopolitical winds were shifting. The empires around Moldavia were becoming too large, and his small nation was becoming too exhausted. He reportedly told Bogdan that if the time came when he could no longer defend the country through arms, he should seek a path of honourable tribute. He taught his son that a true leader knows when to be a lion and when to be a fox. His goal was never eternal war. His goal was the eternal survival of his people. He had fought so that his descendants wouldn't have to fight as hard. On July 2nd, 1504, the bells of every church in Moldavia began to toll. The Lion of the Carpathians was dead. The mourning was so intense that chroniclers described it as if the sun itself had lost its light. People from every corner of the land, peasants who had followed him into the mud of Vaslui, boyars who had feared his justice, and monks who had prayed for his health, flocked to Putna. They didn't just bury a king, they buried a father. In the decades that followed, the Ottoman Empire would eventually succeed in making Moldavia a vassal state, but they could never truly digest it. Because of the stability and identity Stephen had built, Moldavia maintained its own laws, its own faith, and its own nobility for centuries, a feat almost unique among the Balkan nations swallowed by the Ottoman expansion. When we look back at the 47 years of iron and faith, we see a masterclass in nation building. Stephen the Great had taken a fragmented, vulnerable principality and turned it into a regional power that commanded respect from Rome to Constantinople. He proved that a small nation, led by a visionary who values loyalty over terror and strategy over ego, can change the course of history. He wasn't a saint in the modern peaceful sense. He was a hard man for a hard age. He could be ruthless, he could be cold, and his hands were stained with the blood of thousands. But everything he did was driven by a singular, unyielding devotion to the land he called home. As he was laid to rest in his simple marble tomb at Putna, the legend was only beginning. The man was dead, but the athlete of Christ was about to become an immortal symbol of resistance, a ghost that would haunt the dreams of every sultan who ever dared to look north toward the Moldavian hills. If you walk into a bookstore today, anywhere from London to New York, you will find countless shelves dedicated to the myth of Dracula. The name Vlad the Impaler has been transformed into a global brand of gothic horror, a caricature of blood and bats. But if you travel to the rolling hills of Romania and the Republic of Moldova, you will find a different name etched into the very stones of the land. You will see statues in every city square, and you will see his face on the currency. You will hear him spoken of not as a monster, but as a father. This is the great paradox of history. Why does pop culture celebrate the man who failed while overlooking the man who succeeded? To understand why the Ottoman Empire feared Stephen the Great more than Dracula, we have to look at the difference between a nightmare and a reality. A nightmare, like Vlad, is terrifying while you're asleep, but you eventually wake up. A reality, like Stephen, is something you have to wake up to every single day for 47 years. The Ottoman Expansion was a machine designed to swallow nations whole. It was built on the idea that resistance was futile because the Sultan had more men, more gold, and more time than anyone else. Vlad the Impaler tried to break that machine with shock and awe. He used the forest of the impaled to create a psychological trauma that would haunt the Ottoman soldiers. It was effective, yes, but it was unsustainable. Vlad's reign was a series of chaotic explosions that ultimately left his country vulnerable and himself in a Hungarian prison. But Stephen the Great didn't just want to haunt the Sultan's dreams, he wanted to break the Sultan's math. He understood that medieval warfare was a game of attrition, logistics, and identity. He didn't just kill soldiers, he destroyed the Ottoman Empire's ability to govern his land. He turned every peasant into a part of the state, every church into a monument of defiance, and every valley into a tactical trap. The Ottomans feared Stephen because he was a professional. He was a statesman who could navigate the complex webs of Moldavian history with the same skill he used to navigate the marshes of Vaslui. When Mehmed the Conqueror looked at Vlad, he saw a rebel he needed to execute. When he looked at Stephen, he saw a rival he couldn't defeat. This is the modern lesson we often overlook. In our world of viral moments and shock value, we tend to focus on the loudest and most violent figures. But true power, the kind that changes the course of centuries, is often found in the quiet, persistent resilience of a leader who builds something that can outlast their own life. Stephen the Great didn't just win battles, he built a culture that refused to be erased. Even today, the identity of the people in this region is anchored in the foundations he laid 500 years ago. As we look back at the Battle of Vaslui or the scorched earth of the White Valley, we see a man who was the ultimate athlete of Christ, but also a man who was deeply, sometimes brutally human. He was a reminder that the defense of freedom is never a single glorious moment. It is a long, grueling marathon of iron and faith. He proved that a small nation, when led with absolute clarity of purpose, can become a wall that an empire cannot climb. The Sultan feared him not because he was a vampire who drank blood, but because he was a king who commanded loyalty. He was a man who knew that a nation's true borders are not drawn on a map, but in the hearts of its people. So, the next time you hear the name Dracula, think of the man who stood beside him in the Transylvanian camps. Think of the prince who saw his father murdered and chose to build a sanctuary instead of just a grave. History may favour the flamboyant and the macabre, but the ground we walk on is shaped by the steady and the strong. Stephen the Great remains the ghost in the machine of the Ottoman Expansion, a silent witness to the fact that even the greatest empires have a breaking point, and that point is usually a small country with a leader who refuses to bend. Before we conclude this journey into the heart of the 15th century, I want to ask you, if you were a ruler in Stephen's position, caught between three massive empires, would you have chosen the path of the lion or the path of the fox? Is it better to be remembered for the terror you inspired, like Vlad, or for the nation you preserved, like Stephen? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this deep dive into the hidden layers of history gave you a new perspective, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who thinks they know the story of Dracula. There is so much more to our past than the myths we've been told, and together we're going to find it. Thank you for watching, and stay curious.